Have you ever wondered why God created sex? Now, some of the reasons are pretty obvious, and we'll talk about those. But I think there might be some deeper reasons that maybe haven't fully gone through your mind. Now, why is this important? You remember from a few sessions ago the story about my mom and her new email account and going and closing all the windows in the house. My mom was confused because she didn't understand the design and the purpose of a computer and an email account. Well, what we learned and what we talked about is freedom's not doing whatever we want if it feels good. Freedom is orienting our lives with God's design. So when we know why God made sex and we take that to heart, then we're free. Because remember, God is the creator. First thing we learn about God in the scriptures is in the beginning, God created. Thus, there's a purpose for family, a purpose for marriage, and there's a purpose for sex. So freedom means living our lives according to God's design. So what is God's design? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's start with the first one, which is pretty obvious, which is procreation. In other words, making babies. Genesis 1:27 and 28, all the way back to the beginning says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." God made human beings, and what does he do? He commands us to multiply and then fill the earth. Now, this seems pretty obvious, but part of God's design for sex is to make babies. And this is important because if you are sexually active with somebody, you're engaging in what you might call a baby-making act, even if a baby doesn't result. Part of the purpose of sex is that God has given it to us to procreate, multiply, and fill the earth. Now that one's pretty obvious, but let's look at the second one, which is really important as well, which is unity. We find procreation in Genesis chapter 1. Now we move to the second chapter in the Bible, and we find the second purpose for sex. Genesis 2:24 says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Now keep in mind, this is talking about marriage, because it says a man leaves his father and his mother, God's design for the household, and holds fast to his wife. So this is about marriage, and they become one flesh. Now think about something interesting. Any biological function you can perform as an individual, such as respiration or digestion or blood circulation. But there's one biological function in which male and female each have half. And when they come together, they perform a whole function or purpose, which is reproduction. This is at the heart of what the Bible means by one flesh. Now, I used to think this was just a spiritual idea, but then I learned that there's actually a chemical in the human body in men and women, but particularly strong in women, called oxytocin. And some even refer to it as the bonding hormone. Now, what's interesting is it's released primarily in women 3 times. Number 1, when a woman gives birth. Number 2, when a woman is nursing. And number 3, when she's sexually active. In other words, when you're sexually active with somebody, chemicals are released in your body, desiring a deeper union and connection. This is a part of what Genesis 2 is talking about, that a man leaves his father and mother and bonds with his wife spiritually, emotionally, physically, biochemically. They become one. So sex is about making babies, but it's also about bonding 2 people together, a man and his wife, in a permanent relationship. But the third one is one maybe you haven't heard before. The third purpose of sex is to foreshadow heaven. You see, the one flesh union is a beautiful image of our eternal union with God. It's what you might call a foretaste of what it means to truly be known by God and by other people. You see, the one flesh union involves an emotional, relational, spiritual, and physical element. But when people in the area of sex focus just on the physical, they miss the deeper unity, the intimate connection that occurs between two people in the act of sex. It is this kind of holistic union that foreshadows the greater union we will have with God and others in heaven. And this is sometimes hard for people to grasp today because our culture is obsessed with sex. You know this. Virtually every song, almost every movie, advertising, sex is everywhere. You know what the Bible calls this? The Bible calls this idolatry, when we worship the created thing, sex, rather than the Creator who gave us bodies and gave us sexuality. See, here's a tough reality, is that the craving of the human heart cannot be fulfilled by sex. It can't. Our culture promises you if you just buy this new shirt or this clothing, or you just get this new human relationship, your heart will be filled. But friends, it can't. Like, I am blessed with an amazing wife, and I love my relationship with her. But can I tell you, in any relationship, sex is one small piece in terms of time and the relationship that itself cannot hold a relationship together. It is good, and it is beautiful, and it is meaningful. It's a gift from God. But if you think sex is going to fill your heart and give you meaning, friends, you're going to be disappointed. In fact, some of you might be disappointed as we talk about how sex foretastes heaven, but there's not sex in heaven. You might think, oh man, this is disappointing. Well, if you feel that way, it might be because you're failing to understand that sex merely foreshadows the depth of relationship we have in heaven. You see, the deepest cry in the human heart is for relationship, to know and to be known. And God has given us sex as a blessing in this life, for procreation, for unity, and as one way of foretasting and anticipating, so to speak, the kind of union we will have with God and others in heaven. Now, before we wrap up this session, there's two really important myths we just need to unpack briefly. One of them is that some people say sex is not a big deal. Maybe you've heard this. Since the 60s and 70s, there's been this movement in Western culture called the sexual revolution, trying to overturn some of the traditional teachings about sex and love and marriage. And one of the ideas was that sex is just kind of like having a glass of water. It doesn't really mean anything. It's just a biological act. I think in your heart of hearts, you know this isn't true. There was a recent blockbuster movie with a well-known actor and a well-known actress. And in this movie, it was PG-13, as I read about it, described that there was a sex scene in this movie. And the actor was interviewed on a major news station, and he was asked, what's it like to film that scene? What do you do to protect your female co-star? And you could tell that he was really nervous, like, I make sure there's not too many people on set, I make sure she's okay, and then he changed the subject. And it kind of hit me. I thought, if sex is not a big deal, why did he ask him about that scene, but not another scene? Why didn't he ask him, say, what's it like to sit down and have dinner with this famous actress? What's it like to walk down the hall? The reason he asks about the sex scene is because we know sex means something. In fact, the actress for this was the first time she had performed such a scene in the movie. So it turns out she called her mom the night before and said, Mom, I've never felt so vulnerable in my life. Can you just tell me that everything is going to be okay? And she got herself drunk for one scene filming this movie. Guess what scene it was? It was a sex scene, because we know sex means something. It's not the biggest thing, that's not my point, but it's a myth to say it's not a big deal and that it doesn't matter. Second, maybe you've heard or been tempted to think this, that sex is just a private act. That what happens in the bedroom stays in the bedroom. Maybe you've heard it like the famous Las Vegas advertising phrase, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So does what happened in the bedroom stay in the bedroom? The reality is it doesn't. Think about sexually transmitted diseases. Every year there's 20 million new cases, and half of them are young people 15 to 24 years old. Second, children. Sex produces kids. So if there's anything that won't stay in a bedroom, it's kids. But third, how people act and treat each other sexually carries itself out of the bedroom. So often a guy will say, "Oh, she wanted it," and she'll say, "No, I didn't." And what happens is the way they treat each other and treat other people goes out of the bedroom and affects our character and our relationships with other people. Friends, God designed sex to be an intimate, private act between two people. But it's a myth to say that what happens in the bedroom stays in the bedroom. Look, here's the bottom line. We've been talking about how real freedom comes from not living according to whatever we think is right or what feels good, but orienting our lives around God's truth. Freedom is living according to God's design. Well, God certainly intends some people to be single and some people to be married. And marriage is the context in which God has given us sex. And his purposes for sex are, number one, to make babies. Number two, for unity. And number three, a foretaste of heaven. If we really want to love God and we want to love other people, let's live according to God's design. Enjoy your discussions. We'll see you back at the end. How far is too far? If you're in a relationship or have thought about being in a relationship, clearly this has gone through your mind. Well, the Bible doesn't give us a specific level of how far is too far for everybody. But actually, I think the Bible does something better. It gives us principles to apply to our different relationships, including romantic relationships. And a principle that's always helped me is found in the book of Philippians, chapter 4, verse 8. Paul says, think about things that are true, that are honorable, that are just, that are pure, and things that are lovely. So let me ask you a question. Guys, if you're in a relationship with a girl, can you hold her hand and be thinking about things that are lovely and pure? Sure. Girls, can you be in a relationship with a guy and give him a hug and be thinking about things that are lovely and pure? Sure. Well, how about if you're in a relationship, can you be making out and thinking about things that are lovely and pure? Well, that's a different question, isn't it? How about touching each other in different parts of your body, thinking about things that are lovely and pure? Now I know that we think we're starting to cross a line. See, rather than asking the question, how far can I go? I'd encourage you to ask a different question. How do you love this other person? In other words, how do you treat this other person so they're thinking about things that are lovely and worthy of praise? I think if we approach it that way, rather than how far we can go, it changes everything. We'll see you next week.